Okay, so Beth, we're here together. Your video isn't working great, but we have the audio. And as I wrote to you, I am asking some of my wisest sustainability friends to reflect on this powerful time of solidarity and fluidity with the COVID virus. As Milton Friedman says, you know, when we're in crisis, that what happens is that's the moment when ideas that are laying around suddenly become viable and implemented. And so I wanted to capture from you in this moment before, you know, the mood changes wherever which way it's going to go. Uh, what you think at a practical level are some ideas that you see as possibilities now of things that we could cause to be laying around? And if you just start by saying like one or two sentences about um, who you are, and then just launch. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Mm, yeah, I'm happy to be in this conversation. As you said, my name's Beth Sawin. I'm the co-director of Climate Interactive. Um, I'm a biologist who turned into a complex systems modeler when I met Danella Meadows, who's our mutual friend, Vicki. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and as we were chatting before you turned on the recording, uh, you know, you and I and many others have been thinking about all of this for lots of decades. So it's fascinating to watch this moment. And I agree with what you said about in a crisis, ideas that have been around can be adopted or repurposed or have a little entry point they might not have had. And one idea that I'm offering up in this moment is something we call multi-solving at Climate Interactive. And we use that to talk about this huge opportunity space where one action could be one, use of time, or sometimes it's a use of money, solves multiple problems at the same time. And frankly, the deeper you are into crisis, I think the more you need to be able to do that. We can't afford to tackle one problem at a time. And that's kind of countercultural. We tend to, I think, face big problems and try to break them down into smaller pieces. It seems more manageable, like climate change on its own, isn't that a big enough problem? And now we have a pandemic, isn't that a big enough problem? And we know we have a crisis of inequality. Well, that's a huge problem. And our temptation is to have experts in each of those domains, go off and fix those problems. But what we argue with multi-solving and what we see evidence for is that some problems actually get easier to solve when you approach them together. So it's that opposite impulse. It's actually to aggregate big problems into one even bigger that then is potentially more solvable. So I know that sounds really theoretical, and so I'll just share a few examples, because for the last 5 years or so, we've been looking for bright spots around the world where we see people acting in this multi-solving fashion. And one of the first themes that we noticed is it often does emerge out of a crisis. So that maybe makes our attention perk up right now in this moment. One example that we studied is something called the Green Curtain movement in Japan, which is factories that built living curtains made of greenery, of vines basically, to cool the buildings. So they needed less air conditioning, less energy. So that meant less greenhouse gas emissions. But the vines were edible fruits that then went into the company cafeteria. And this movement started in response to the energy crisis in Japan that happened after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So there's the beginning of a theme, right, is in a response to crisis, can you solve multiple problems at the same time? Another example we studied comes from New Zealand. There's a program that's about energy retrofitting of homes in New Zealand, so in the residential sector, so things like new boilers, better windows, better insulation. But the really interesting thing about that project is that doctors can refer patients for a home energy upgrade. So like instead of take an aspirin and see me in the morning, it's like get new windows and new insulation in the attic. And that program in New Zealand started as a response to the 2008 economic downturn. And it was at first a program to get the construction industry back to work. And then actually academics started to look at, well, what else was changing in these homes that were being improved? And they were seeing, particularly for people with respiratory illness, that they were going to the emergency room less, they needed less medication, they were actually saving money on the public health side, which is how the doctors and some funding from public health came into a program that's about energy efficiency, climate change, good jobs in the construction sector. So we see these examples wherever we look for them at every scale, from very local to national or even regional projects. The interesting thing about them is that they are, while we find them everywhere that we look, they're rare. They're the anomalies. This isn't the way that people tend to organize themselves to work, and there's many barriers. Different departments, from construction to public health, like when do people in those two fields generally meet and talk and plan together? And then they speak a different language, and they're often their resources come out of different budgets. So there's a lot of systems change that needs to happen to capture those opportunities. And I guess one thing we're going to get to see and try to push for is, in this moment of crisis, can we help do those systemic changes to enable those opportunities, which are really just sitting there kind of waiting to be taken advantage of.
A word you just used, there's so much to this, but a word you just used is budgets. And I wonder if budgets are, the boring thing about budgeting is actually a point of intervention, that the budgets that institutions have, that governments, the state, local, the whole budgetary process is allocating money to a variety of pots and absolutely not looking at multi-solving. Are there any hopeful bits on the horizon about repurposing or restructuring or rethinking budgeting so that with integrity, money can flow to where, money can be like blood, and it can flow to the places that need healing or nourishment, and then move, but to do it responsibly, not just some, bozo in the basement, just deciding that money's going to go elsewhere. So what are your thoughts about that, about the power of budgets to either obstruct or empower what needs to happen, this multi-solving?
Yeah, well, I think you've put your finger on part of it for sure. And one example I often give is in turning off fossil fuel dependent infrastructure, there's a huge savings on the public health side, which comes from reduced diseases related to air pollution in particular, which is an interesting connection to this current pandemic, because the way that our respiratory systems are compromised by air pollution also makes people more vulnerable to the coronavirus. So we have this intersection of the fossil fuel infrastructure, the virus, and climate change. And last year, the World Health Organization came out with a report, which many people don't know this. The World Health Organization said that the amount of money that we will save by being on track to meet the Paris Agreement climate goals is basically the same amount of money it will take to be on that path. Okay, the health benefits are of the same order of magnitude as the costs of being on a clean energy path to meet the Paris goals. That, for people who are like, oh, climate change is going to be a big sacrifice, but we have to do it, we have the World Health Organization telling us, well, they're kind of going to balance each other out, the costs and the benefits. The challenge is that it's public health, it's public utilities, public works, energy departments, transportation departments that have to pay, and health departments and hospitals that will have the savings. And so at Climate Interactive for the last few years, we have been experimenting with how to bring people together in order to overcome that problem of how we've designed our world into different jurisdictions and silos, budgetary and decision making, both. And there I would really hold up as one of the things that gives me the most hope in this time has been a multi-year partnership we've had with a real leader in the U.S. called the Partnership for Southern Equity. They're an organization based in Atlanta. They are experts at what they call values-based organizing. Many of their senior leadership comes out of the civil rights movement. And in Atlanta, we've been working together to pilot creating a network that spans all of these different potential benefits. So that includes people who are concerned about water and climate, but also economic growth and jobs and health and opportunity. And for now, going on 3 years, every other month for half a day or so, that network, which might include about 70 people at this point, has been meeting not to do discrete projects, although many projects have boiled up out of what they're doing, but to come and understand each other's world. And our theory of that work and that investment, and we're starting to see the evidence for it, is that if you can pre-build the relationships in a system, then you allow people to act together at moments of opportunity when they have these common interests. And so the common interest might be a park program that's built in a way that doesn't create gentrification, that also helps to manage stormwater that might get worse with climate change, that might also provide good jobs for the youth in the neighborhood. If there's, an RFP, the mayor says there's money on the table, the chances of assembling that constellation of people before the RFP expires in real life is very, very low. But what we have now is 3 years of relationships and trust and hard conversations, particularly a multiracial conversation about equity in the American South. Pre-growing is how Nathaniel Smith, the founder of Partnership for Southern Equity, talks about it. Pre-growing a network enables people to then move in these moments of opportunity to seize the fact that their common interests meet in certain places. And what we're finding, because another thing we need to do in these times of crisis when resources are I don't want to say limited, but we are outspent when it comes to the forces of the status quo. I think it's fair to say that. For relatively small investment, which is really nurturing people, bringing them together, a pot of coffee and some bagels and a meeting space, what you start to see is a network that can change how large amounts of money are deployed. So one example is one of the city departments in Atlanta recently updated its capital improvement plan for, I want to say, $1.2 billion. I think I've got that wrong. I'd have to check. Maybe it's 10 point. Gosh, sorry, long day. I forgot.
Big number.
Yeah, big number, and I wish I could nail it specifically. But the bottom line is that in deciding how to reinvigorate their capital improvement plan, they put in a whole set of provisions about equity when it comes to hiring and procurement. And that was influenced by conversations that happened in this network. And so that's just one example for how spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, you can see tens of millions of dollars deployed differently. And I guess the other thing I would add about what's different about this approach is that it's not the kind of thing that can start with the end in mind, that you're building a network for opportunities that you don't even know what they're going to be, or crises that you don't know what they're going to be. This network started before the last U.S. election, so we're dealing with a different president than when we started. There's a new mayor in Atlanta, which has opened up some opportunities. There's new, obviously, threats and challenges. And so another thing on my mind in these very uncertain feeling times are what are the activities that we can do that are no regrets, that we know are going to give us some advantages, kind of no matter which direction the future goes. Opportunities open up or threats emerge and we have to move to the defensive. A trusting network of relationships can do both of those.
This is like so amazing. I mean, my mind is going all different directions. It's sort of a more actionable from individuals and groups locally. When you think about what networks you're part of locally, you know, building networks of trust is so important. And whether it's the choir or the community theater or the knitting group or, or all those little commissions that are Island County commissioners, they have, small groups that are attending to shoreline or to, forestry. All of this web of relatedness is activated in this moment. I can see it, just the mutual aid that's happening and the crossover between networks just to produce face masks, to recognize that as a resource that we can invest in now consciously and even name it. Like, I'm so glad I'm part of this choir because now we know each other and we sing together. And what else can we do together? It's, that's very, very, very micro local, but these are principles that can be applied. And it also, it's just so brilliant because this is how the dominant system repurposes itself, is that it has the money and power to convene groups that are interest groups for business as usual. And those of us who are not in that position maybe don't pay attention to building these networks of mutuality, reciprocity, co-creativity, shared purpose, maybe diversity of audiences. That is such a key for right now, to even just notice what you're part of and who's part of your life. And so I don't know if that resonates with you about taking this big idea and bringing it down to an actionable level locally. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, very much. I think your mind is going in a similar direction. And one thing I would share is that, in the long, windy journey that led us to the idea of multi-solving, one key observation was actually my experience of another crisis, which was 2011 here in Vermont. We were hit by Tropical Storm Irene, which knocked out hundreds of bridges, took out power infrastructure, was quite devastating to lots of people. And that was, for me as a climate expert, my first personal touch with the climate impact. And one thing I did, I'm very glad I did, was I hired a young neighbor who just finished college, and I gave her a phone and a tape recorder, and I asked her to go around the state and see what she noticed. And what was so clear was that days, almost a week before, say, FEMA showed up, what was holding the state together were all of the agencies and volunteer organizations and churches that were already there 365 days a year supporting people. So the local food shelf had a list of who needed what, and they had trucks to get things wherever it needed to go. And another organization that fixed homes for low-income people and did energy retrofits, they had a list of volunteers and an email and phone tree. And so those were, and small businesses that, like the local brewery, had clean water that anyone could come and fill up their carboy of water. And so I noticed by observing that, or how the farmer's market was the only place you could get vegetables for a while when the supermarkets didn't have electricity, that we have this infrastructure of care that is already in normal times essential, and that one of the most strategic places to fund or to put resources to prepare for climate impacts, I learned from that, was this everyday infrastructure. And that was, in some ways, the genesis of the recognition that one investment could do multiple things. And since then, now we have words for that, like resilience hubs out of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. That was one of the innovations that really paid off and now is being replicated, from what I understand, in Puerto Rico. So people are discovering and noticing that some things that are really essential anyway also can be lifelines, in these uncertain crisis events that we can't exactly pinpoint when and where, but we know we're going to be experiencing more and more of.
That is so great. And I have to resist the impulse to keep going because I'm trying to get these to be like little 20-minute lips of wisdom. But I really love what we got to. Like the phrase I've been saying is, turns out we really need the swamp, we really need the bureaucracy. We need that whole human services infrastructure, casual government, business. We need that architecture and that infrastructure of social connections. That more than, yes, we need food and yes, we need shelter, but that's really a crucial part of making it through these times, whether it's the pandemic or, the other tsunamis that are on their way. So thank you, Beth. If you have any final words, you can say them, or we can close it here.
Well, one thing that we didn't have a chance to talk about is this idea of economic stimulus, helping the economy recover. I think that's going to be a conversation at all levels for the next many months. And I think it is a tremendous opportunity to bring this idea of multi-solving forward, because we can't afford for those trillions of dollars to not also address equity, racial equity, economic equity, gender equity, and climate change, as well as helping businesses recover and families recover. So being poised to advocate for that, because certainly what we see, at least in this first pass through, is that many, many special interest groups are very poised to advocate for the opposite of multi-solving, for very targeted flows of resources to particular agendas and interests. So I think we have a short window to really hone our narrative about what is a multi-solving recovery to the pandemic look like.
So do you have a website where people can go and watch that conversation unfold and borrow ideas?
Yeah, our website is climateinteractive.org, and there's a whole section there on multi-solving. Those stories I started out from Japan and New Zealand you'll find there, and current writing about the pandemic as well.
Perfect. Yeah, boy, thank you so much, Beth. It was
Thanks, Vicki.
so rich. Okay,